Don't fall asleep tonight. Because the man sitting behind you isn't a passenger. He's waiting for the lights to go out. And by the time anyone realizes what he's doing, the boat will already be drifting through the dark, with bodies no one heard fall. On the night of May 16, 1900, aboard the steamer Prince Karl crossing the quiet waters of Lake Mälaren, there was no storm, no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. The lake was calm, almost too calm, reflecting a sky that gave nothing away. Inside the vessel, passengers moved about without fear, settling into seats, exchanging quiet conversations, preparing for a routine journey that had been made countless times before. No one was watching anyone too closely. No one had a reason to. And that is exactly what made what happened next possible. Because among those passengers was a man who had already made a decision. A decision that did not begin on that boat. A decision that had been forming for years. But what makes this story even more disturbing is not just what he did. It's the fact that there were chances to stop him. Clear signs. Repeated warnings. Moments where someone could have stepped in and changed everything. And still, nothing was done. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy real cases like this, stories that stay with you long after they're over, you can subscribe. It's a simple way to support, and it helps more people discover these stories. Now let's go back to where this really started. The investigation into the Prince Karl incident began quietly at first, with officials trying to understand how a routine journey had turned into something so deeply unsettling. What they initially expected to be a simple criminal case quickly expanded into something far more complex. The name Johan Philip Nordlund began appearing repeatedly in old records, each one revealing another layer of violence and imprisonment. Authorities discovered that his past was not a straight line but a pattern of escalation that had never been properly interrupted. Each prison record showed repeated offenses, but also repeated concerns raised by staff who believed he posed a long-term danger. Yet those warnings did not translate into lasting restrictions, and over time his release became possible under legal procedures that would later be questioned. Investigators studying the Prince Karl voyage began mapping his movements before boarding, attempting to reconstruct his mindset in the days leading up to the attack. They found that nothing in his behavior suggested sudden change, instead everything pointed toward a gradual build-up of intent. Witnesses from the ship described him as calm, detached, and almost invisible in his interactions with others. That absence of emotional expression would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. As the ship continued its journey, investigators believe critical moments of escalation occurred within confined sections of the vessel. Passengers later recalled fragmented sounds and brief disturbances that did not immediately make sense at the time. Panic spread only after the realization that these disturbances were not isolated incidents but part of a larger unfolding threat. Communication across the vessel broke down as crew members attempted to coordinate responses in increasingly chaotic conditions. The lack of visibility inside the ship made it difficult to locate Nordlund quickly, allowing confusion to spread further. When he was finally confronted, witnesses described an unsettling calmness, as if he had been expecting the moment. The confrontation ended with his restraint, bringing the immediate violence aboard the ship to a sudden close. But the aftermath was not silence in the emotional sense, because shock had already taken hold of everyone involved. Passengers were eventually escorted off the vessel, each carrying their own version of events that would later be compared and analyzed. The case would later become a major reference point in discussions about prison release systems and risk evaluation failures. Officials reviewing the case emphasized how multiple opportunities existed to intervene before the situation escalated to irreversible levels. Each missed warning became part of a larger institutional failure that would later be studied and debated extensively. For survivors, however, the analysis meant little compared to the emotional weight of what they had lived through. Many struggled with recurring memories of the night, unable to separate ordinary life from what they had experienced. Over time, the Prince Karl incident became more than a case file, it became a lasting reminder of vulnerability in everyday travel. The legal proceedings eventually concluded with a guilty verdict supported by overwhelming evidence and consistent witness testimony. Nordlund's behavior during trial remained detached, reflecting the same emotional distance reported by those who encountered him earlier. The final judgment brought legal closure but did not erase the psychological impact left on survivors. In the months following, discussions across Sweden shifted toward preventing similar failures in future risk assessments. Policy reviews were initiated, focusing on strengthening evaluation systems for individuals with violent criminal histories. The Prince Carl case continued to be referenced in training programs for law enforcement and correctional institutions. It became a study example of how systemic gaps can allow dangerous individuals to re-enter society. Survivors often spoke publicly in later years, contributing to awareness and advocacy around public safety reforms. Their testimonies ensured that the human cost of the tragedy was never reduced to statistics alone. Even decades later, the story of the Prince Carl massacre remains part of Sweden's criminal history narrative. It stands as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into irreversible consequences when warning signs are ignored. The investigation into the Prince Carl incident ultimately reshaped conversations about responsibility, prevention, and institutional accountability across the country. Today, the memory of what happened aboard the Prince Carl continues to echo through history, not as a story of a single man alone, but as a reminder of systems, silence, and the fragile distance between ordinary travel and irreversible tragedy that still lingers beyond the lake even today. The investigation into the Prince Carl incident did not remain a small local inquiry for long, because the deeper officials looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. What was once treated as a single violent outbreak slowly transformed into a wider question about how such a man had been moving through society unchecked. Johan Philip Nordlund's name surfaced repeatedly in archived prison documents, each record revealing a history marked by theft, aggression, and repeated institutional warnings. These were not isolated incidents but part of a consistent behavioral pattern that stretched back years before the voyage on Lake Mälaren. Investigators noted that multiple evaluations had already identified him as unstable, yet those assessments did not result in permanent containment measures. Instead, he moved in and out of incarceration, each release adding another opportunity for escalation rather than rehabilitation. As detectives reconstructed his timeline before boarding the Prince Carl, they began focusing on the days leading up to the journey. Witness accounts from earlier encounters described him as detached, quiet, and observant, rarely engaging unless necessary. This emotional distance became a recurring detail across multiple testimonies, suggesting a psychological profile that was difficult to interpret in simple terms. On the ship itself, passengers recalled nothing unusual at first, only the ordinary rhythm of travel across familiar waters. But beneath that surface normality, small disruptions began to appear, subtle enough to be dismissed individually but significant in accumulation. A sudden silence in a corridor, a passing figure moving without acknowledgement, a sense of unease that no one could explain directly. Investigators later determined that these moments aligned with the earliest stages of the incident, though at the time they went unnoticed. As night deepened, movement inside the vessel became more restricted, and passengers settled into a false sense of stability. It was in this environment that Nordlund's actions began to unfold, not as a single explosion of violence but as a sequence of controlled steps. Crew members later described difficulty in maintaining communication between sections of the ship, which slowed their ability to respond effectively. The confined structure of the vessel intensified confusion, turning ordinary corridors into unpredictable spaces where visibility was limited. Passengers who crossed paths with Nordlund during this period described him as calm, almost mechanical in his movements. That calmness contrasted sharply with the growing disorder around him, creating a psychological imbalance that witnesses would never forget. When the situation escalated fully, it did so faster than most could comprehend, leaving little time for coordinated response. Panic spread through sections of the ship as individuals attempted to understand what was happening while simultaneously trying to escape it. Some moved toward higher decks, others remained frozen in place, unable to process the unfolding danger. The crew eventually attempted to isolate the threat, but the delay in recognition had already limited their options significantly. By the time Nordlund was confronted directly, the situation had reached a point where containment was the only remaining objective. Witnesses later recalled that he showed no visible panic or resistance beyond what was necessary in the moment. His behavior remained controlled even during confrontation, a detail that investigators would later analyze extensively in psychological evaluations. Once restrained, the immediate danger aboard the Prince Karl ended, but the emotional impact remained fully active among survivors. The vessel continued its journey toward the dock, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than the events themselves. Passengers were separated for questioning upon arrival, each individual attempting to reconstruct a timeline from fragmented memory. Medical personnel attended to both physical injuries and psychological shock, as many struggled to articulate what they had witnessed. Investigators began compiling statements, cross-referencing them to identify consistent patterns within the chaos of recollection. Despite variations in detail, one element remained consistent across testimonies: the unsettling calm displayed by Nordlund throughout the incident. Authorities quickly expanded their focus beyond the ship itself, reviewing his entire criminal history and institutional handling. What they found revealed repeated opportunities where intervention could have altered the course of events entirely. These findings raised immediate concerns about systemic failures within the processes designed to evaluate dangerous individuals. Public awareness of the case began to grow as reports spread, turning a local investigation into a national discussion. Newspapers detailed the events aboard the Prince Karl, often emphasizing the contradiction between ordinary travel and extreme violence. Readers reacted with shock and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the normal appearance of the journey with its outcome. Debates soon followed regarding rehabilitation, public safety, and the limits of institutional responsibility in cases of repeated violent behavior. Some argued that earlier intervention would have prevented the tragedy entirely, while others questioned the fairness of indefinite detention. These discussions reflected a broader tension within society about how to balance rights and risk in criminal justice systems. As the investigation continued, Nordlund remained in custody, awaiting formal proceedings that would determine his legal fate. Psychological experts were brought in to assess his mental state, reviewing years of behavioral records and observed conduct. Their evaluations highlighted long-standing patterns of emotional detachment and aggression, consistent with earlier institutional concerns. These conclusions reinforced the view that warning signs had existed long before the incident, but had not been acted upon decisively. Preparations for trial began as prosecutors assembled evidence from witness accounts, forensic analysis, and historical documentation. The case gradually shifted from an isolated incident to a broader examination of systemic oversight and accountability. Survivors were prepared to testify, their statements forming the emotional core of the legal proceedings. Each testimony carried the weight of personal experience, transforming abstract investigation into human consequence. As the trial date approached, public attention intensified, with many viewing the case as a defining moment in criminal justice debate. The Prince Karl incident had already moved beyond the boundaries of a single crime, becoming a symbol of institutional failure and human vulnerability. Survivors entered the courtroom with heavy silence, each step reflecting the emotional weight of what they had experienced aboard the Prince Karl. The atmosphere inside was tense, not because of what might be said, but because of what could never be fully explained. Johan Philip Nordlund sat with an expression that remained unchanged, as if the proceedings were distant from his own reality. Prosecutors began by laying out the sequence of events, carefully reconstructing the night through witness testimony and documented evidence. Each detail presented added another layer to the growing understanding of how the situation unfolded from calm travel into chaos. Survivors described moments of confusion, fear, and disbelief, their voices often breaking as they attempted to relive events they had tried to forget. The court listened in silence, recognizing that no legal language could fully capture the human impact of what had occurred. Defense arguments focused on procedural questions, but they struggled against the weight of consistent and overlapping testimonies. Psychological experts testified regarding Nordlund's long history of emotional detachment and repeated behavioral concerns documented over many years. Their assessments reinforced the conclusion that warning signs had existed but had not been acted upon with sufficient urgency. As proceedings continued, it became increasingly clear that the case extended beyond individual responsibility into broader institutional failure. Questions about earlier release decisions returned repeatedly, shaping discussions both inside and outside the courtroom. Public attention remained intense, with newspapers reporting daily updates that kept the case at the center of national debate. Outside the court, citizens discussed the balance between justice and safety, often divided over how such cases should be prevented in the future. Some believed the system had failed to protect the public, while others feared the consequences of removing legal safeguards for rehabilitation. Inside the courtroom, however, the focus remained on the lived experiences of those who survived the night on the vessel. Their testimonies formed the emotional foundation of the case, grounding legal arguments in human reality rather than abstract debate. As the final days of the trial approached, the atmosphere grew heavier, marked by anticipation and emotional exhaustion. Nordlund remained largely silent, offering little reaction to the evidence that directly connected him to the events aboard the ship. The court eventually reached its conclusion, delivering a verdict of guilty on multiple counts including murder and attempted murder. The decision was met with a quiet release of tension from those present, though it did not erase the trauma that remained. Sentencing followed, reflecting the severity of the crimes and acknowledging the irreversible impact on the victims and their families. Outside the courtroom, reactions varied between relief, sorrow, and reflection on how the tragedy had unfolded from preventable circumstances. Nordlund's legal process concluded with his execution in Västerås later that year, closing the official chapter of the case. The announcement marked the end of proceedings, but not the end of memory for those who had lived through the night. Survivors continued to carry the emotional weight long after the legal system had finished its role in the case. Many struggled with recurring memories, finding it difficult to return to normal life without reminders of what they had witnessed. Support systems were established for some, while others relied on personal networks to process the long-term psychological impact. The incident gradually entered public memory as one of the most disturbing maritime crimes in Swedish history. Its legacy extended beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing how institutions evaluated risk and managed individuals with violent histories. Policy reviews were initiated in the aftermath, focusing on improving communication between correctional systems and public safety authorities. These reforms aimed to prevent similar failures by strengthening evaluation processes and ensuring warning signs were not overlooked again. In academic and legal discussions, the Prince Carl case became a reference point for examining systemic gaps in prevention frameworks. It was often cited as an example of how multiple small failures can combine into a single catastrophic outcome. Survivors who later spoke publicly emphasized the importance of awareness and vigilance in preventing future tragedies. Their voices contributed to a broader understanding of how trauma persists long after physical danger has ended. Even years later, the memory of the journey across Lake Mälaren remained vivid for those who were present. The calm waters that once represented routine travel became permanently associated with fear and irreversible change. Historians documenting the case noted not only the events themselves but also the long-lasting societal impact that followed. The story continued to be studied in criminal justice systems as a lesson in risk assessment and institutional responsibility. It served as a reminder that warnings ignored can evolve into consequences that affect countless lives beyond the immediate moment. The Prince Carl incident remains part of public record, preserved not only as a case study but as a human story of survival and loss. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more real cases, and share your thoughts in the comments below.